Our guest from out of town for this event today is Lance Larsen, down here, professor of English at BYU. You're currently still the chair of the department at BYU of the English department. He specializes in creative writing, especially poetry. He's the author of 5 volumes of published poetry, which is very impressive. He's published essays in many of the notable literary quarterlies, and he reviews, and he also has received prizes and fellowships galore. Very appreciated and productive man of letters. In 2007, he received the National Endowment of the Humanities for the Arts Literature Fellowship in Poetry. From 2002 to 2017, he served as the Poet Laureate of Utah, and he's now mining his own life for his creative writing. Lance comes to this as a literary scholar and an artist. Still no noise. His written memoir, which elevates the ordinary story of a person into literature with its rich style. I started out as a literary person, but now I'm more of a history person. I very much value a person's story in his own voice in whatever form. I like a daily diary, even a dull one, from the information that I get. How many people here keep daily diaries, journals? More than usual, more than in a regular thing. There was a comment here. How many keep journals from time to time? That's better. All right, we'll take that as our measure. I think it's very valuable. Much of my historical work has been based on the published diaries of other people, or unpublished. And I've kept doing myself now for 40 years. I was still starting pretty late. But I think everyone should do it, and I hardly ever get the floor. But what I say, keep a diary. And it isn't just keep a diary for your children or for the greater good of humanity or anything like that, but for yourself. It's the value of the examined life. It's the record. We're told to keep a record, keep a record. Okay. Leonard Arrington used to say that he valued women's diaries 10 to 1 over men's diaries. That's when, and he said they were just much more valuable and interesting. And Laurel, when she worked on her, well, my point is here that women don't keep diaries as often as men do. I wonder if that's still true, but I think it is. And when Laurel was doing her big book, A House of Females, the basic diary she had to use was Wilford Woodruff, because there was no woman who kept a diary as long that went through the whole period. So, and Wilford Woodruff commented one time, I remember, when he said, I must have spent how many thousands of hours writing in my diary. He then kept it for 50 years, I think. And he said, I've never spent any time better than that. It is just true. Keep a record. Okay, I've now said that. I won't say it again. So, I want to, what am I going to do? I've also done lots of oral history. I think anything you can get down is a plus. So please do that. Now, what we're going to do today is I'm going to read you a piece of my autobiography. One of the problems about autobiographies is that women don't write as many of them as men do. And one reason is that they don't think their lives are worth it. They don't think that they deserve having an autobiography. And so they frequently apologize for doing it. They say, oh, I would never have done it, but my children just insisted that I write down my story. Or the neighbors just asked me if I would get these things down. So they always apologize. They frequently apologize. It's worth looking. When you read an autobiography, look in the beginning, see what they say in the preface. I know my life is not valuable, but I've written it anyway. And so that's, I don't like to apologize for doing it, but you see, that's what I'm doing. I am writing my autobiography and I have called it, because I am defensive about it, it has an in-your-face name, I, Claudia. Does that get you? It should. And what are the echoes? Not only I, Nephi, but I, Claudius. I mean, it's got some pretty good ones. So I'm doing that, and I am apologizing for doing it, but I'm doing it anyway. So I'm going to read you a piece from my journal, from my autobiography. People frequently, and I'm going to read the piece, then Lance is going to read a piece, then the time we have left, you may tear these apart, say why they're not worth listening to. You may comment on the techniques that we have used. You may do whatever you want to fill out the time. So I'll read, then Lance will read. So I am writing, here's my piece. People frequently ask me how Richard and I met. After Richard Bushman had been at Harvard for 2 years, he was called on a Mormon mission to the New England states. At that time, the mission home was immediately adjacent to the chapel, both located in old houses built by the Longfellow family. Dick, I call him Dick here, he became Richard in 1992. He was very active in that small branch. He knew the mission president, J. Howard Mon, very well. Sister Mon called him Dick throughout his mission. That was the time of the Korean War, and the missions were at low ebb. Dick got a mission deferment because he lived in Portland, Oregon, where prospective missionaries were few. The New England mission had only 50 missionaries during that time, maybe a quarter of their usual complement, and Dick was frequently sent off by himself to supervise the distant elders in all the New England states and Canada's maritime provinces. President Mon instructed him, stay away from your college friends. Dick was serving in his second mission year when I came from San Francisco to Boston to attend Wellesley College. I began to hear about him from young people in the church as soon as I arrived. He was a fabled figure, spoken of with awe. I thought he must be a hard man, a frightening person, one to avoid. Our actual fateful meeting is a blur to me. There was a group of LDS students gathered in a Harvard College room. Elder Bushman arrived by himself. Why, we can never remember or determine. He must have had some kind of reason. He was not one to break rules, but he turned up in this forbidden place, and we met. He says it was passionate love at first sight. Actually, I think he had heard about me as I had heard about him, and that he knew that my father was a Mormon stake president and that I had a scholarship at Wellesley, suggesting that I was more serious about religion and academics than I actually was. The meeting was soon over. In 1955, I wrote this, and this had taken place in 52. During the first month of school back in 1952, I met a young elder named Richard Bushman. The group that I was with had spoken more than highly of him, and I was not disappointed. He was thoughtful and articulate. His reddish hair grew down over one eye in the manner of a romantic poet. My impression was, what a lovely boy. I wish he'd cut his hair. After Dick had been back in school for a while, our relationship began in deadly earnest. He was never very nice to me. He was stern in his invitations as if this were an unpleasant duty that he had to fulfill. We usually had study dates at the old Wellesley Recreation Building. He seemed so much more mature and serious than I was that we could hardly manage to carry on a conversation. I knew he disapproved of me. I was always surprised when he called and asked me out, or in, as the case was, to the rec hall. I, who had been used to going to every football game, every dance, every concert, found my social life much straitened. Sometimes we walked on the Wellesley campus. Sometimes we attempted a little dancing in the rec hall. Always our conversations were painful and awkward. We could hardly talk to each other. And after a while, each date would be followed by a letter in which he would bawl me out for something or lecture me on something else. I hardly knew what to think about this. During Christmas vacation of my sophomore year, I received some unexpected communication from him, a couple of letters and a nice book. I was surprised by this warmth. I read his well-written letters to my father, who suggested that I should marry this man. I said there wasn't a chance. He was beyond my deserts. My mother gave me the usual lecture about my always selling myself short, but I was not convinced. I was having trouble defining my position. Dick must be doing more than just being nice to me to call me all the time and take me out to some nice things. But I was always miserable in his presence, tongue-tied, stilted, stupid. You can't believe it, can you? But it's true. Yeah. I wasn't even decent company. He was stern and silent. He continued to ask my opinions on things I knew nothing about and treat them considerately. About then, I decided that the whole thing must be a plot of the Cambridge church boys, an assignment from the elders' quorum. So I determined to enjoy it as much as possible, but not to be taken in. It was nice to have him around. He was much sought after, so I should be none the worse for the experience of his company. It would be a good test to see if I could come out of it with some dignity. Then in November, Dick came out one evening and suggested we take a walk. He brought a white carnation on a long stem. We walked and I played with my flower. He wore a long red scarf and carried an umbrella, which he later broke. It had been raining again. We wandered to the edge of Wellesley's beautiful Lake Waban and sat in a rustic nest called a spoon holder. Because, shh, it's for the spooners. A path runs around the lake, and there are 3 or 4 of these little platforms with benches for conversation and for viewing the lake. The campus legend is that after being walked a couple of miles around the lake, 3 times, a couple would stop in a spoon holder and there would be a proposal of marriage. If no proposal, the male would be pushed into the lake. But Dick did not understand that part about walking around the lake. I had no idea of any serious intent. On that unseasonably warm, faded evening, Dick sternly and seriously proposed marriage. I was completely surprised and undone. He said that he loved me and had for some time. I was astonished. I was not completely naive. I'd already had a few proposals. I could read the clues, but I never saw this one coming. Instead of leaping up in enthusiasm as many other girls would have done, I wondered if he could be serious, saying, "But you don't know me at all." And he certainly did not. I was interested in frivolous things, nonsense poetry, Gilbert and Sullivan, Broadway musicals, birds, fashion, good times. He was serious, ambitious, driven. I could not believe that he wanted to marry anyone like me. Other girls around were much prettier, more religious than I was. Why was he proposing to me? I was shocked and unhappy that he could be so blind to choose me, but thrilled to be loved by such a man. I came home quite dazed, but very happy. Marrying him was a new idea. Of course, he tells a different story. His memory of the evening was that I accepted him and that we were engaged. I thought we had just moved into a new limbo. We continued our tortured relationship. Stay tuned for the next chapter. All right. Now we'll hear from the pro, Lance.
Wow, thank you, Claudia. Our engagement was just like that, except Jackie was the Richard figure when we were doing it. I appreciate this opportunity. I thought I might start by talking a little bit about some terminology and then read a few things and then open it up to questions. So we're going to talk a little bit about what exactly is memoir? And there's some question about what that means exactly. Let me throw out 6 terms, and we may talk about 3 of those. Claudia mentioned journal writing. Again, very common, or quite common within Mormon circles. less common now than I think 20 or 30 years ago. Also, letters are often a part of memoirs. And I think of letters as journals written to a particular person or audience. Very rare now. What we have instead of those are tweets and emails and so forth, but a good source for personal histories. And then we have personal histories. What exactly is a personal history? When you hear that term, what do you think of? Actually, I want audience participation here. What's a personal history? Yes? A life story. And when do you usually write that? When you're really old on your deathbed, right? 70s or 80s. Usually that's what happens. And who are those intended for? Your posterity. And usually not very many other people are interested in them, right? So the title of our discussion today is Personal History to Memoir. So we wanted to talk a little bit during the Q&A on the differences between those. But as I suggested, they usually are written at the end of one's life. They tend to be chronological. They hit high points. They're didactic, right? They have a particular purpose. Usually you're instructing your kids or you're just reviewing your life. And again, the audience is usually pretty limited. You're interested in your parents' personal history or your own, but rarely do those go public in a big way. Well, memoir, by definition, is a different animal. Usually they're book length. They tend to be narratively driven. The ones that get published tend to focus on something notorious or unusual, sometimes unseemly, not always the case, or they're written by someone famous, or they're ghost written about someone famous, right? Laurel yesterday talked about how she was trying to emphasize the stories of more commonplace people. And so that's one of the cases that we want to make, is that memoir is a broader genre than we might first imagine. There's another genre that sometimes is mentioned in the same breath, and that is personal essay. If memoir focuses on what happened to someone, personal essay might be characterized as the writer thinking about what has happened to him or her. But often they're used interchangeably. We can talk at greater length about these. Sometimes the term nonfiction comes up. That's usually an umbrella term for all of these and other kinds of personal writing. So what I want to do before I read a few examples is start with 3 quotes, which I think characterize the genre quite well for me. And actually, these are personal essayists who write about their experience. So what they say about the personal essay, I think, also holds true for the memoir. So the first one comes from Joan Didion, who is one of the most persuasive writers of New York City ever. She says this: "I write entirely to find out what I'm thinking, what I'm looking at, what I see and what it means, what I want and what I fear. Why did the oil refineries around Carquinez Straits seem sinister to me in the summer of 1956? What is going on in these pictures in my mind?" And I love that exploratory nature. Most memoirists don't sit down and record what they already know. They sit down with questions and they want to move forward. In fact, the Nobel Prize winner Chinua Achebe said, "Writers don't give prescriptions, they give headaches." I think that's true. It's a way of asking difficult questions. Here's a quote from another New Yorker, actually, Philip Lopate, on the introduction to Art of the Personal Essay. He says this about the role of the writer as kind of a truth sayer for the community. He says this: "The trick is to realize that one is not important, except insofar as one's example can serve to elucidate a more widespread human trait and make readers feel a little less lonely and freakish." I think that's what we're all after. We don't want to feel lonely and freakish, and writing in this way is a way of building community. Finally, one final quote. This is Eugene England, who talks about, in his opinion, the centrality of autobiographical writing. This is from a 1995 essay that was published in BYU Studies. "If fiction is the area where Mormons are just now beginning to fulfill the prophetic hopes for Mormon literature, and to have some impact on national and world literature, it is the personal essay, and I would add the memoir, that seems to me to have the greatest potential for making a uniquely valuable Mormon contribution both to Mormon cultural and religious life. Our theological emphasis on life as a stage where the individual self is both tested and created, and our history of close examination in journals and testimony bearing provide resources that have mainly been realized in great sermons and various forms of autobiography, but increasingly find expression in powerful informal essays. So I'm going to read part of a couple of pieces from a book-length memoir about growing up in southern Idaho. And some of the chapters are quite long, up to 20 pages, and they involve lots of narrative and development. The two that I'm going to read are brief. One is just a page and a half, the other one's about 4 pages. It's about 10 minutes if you want to pace your attention. So the first one is called The Bluest Eye. Unfortunately, that's the same title as a novel by Toni Morrison, which I didn't realize I was ripping off her title at the time. I'll probably change it eventually, but this is how it was published. This is called The Bluest Eye. I don't know my age at this point. I was 3rd grade, 4th grade maybe. It takes place in southern Idaho. Without warning, as if following some biblical injunction, the boy reached in and plucked out his left eye. He did it quickly, right hand ambushing his face. My sister and I stepped back. It's rare for a glass eye to make it into your home, and even more rare for it to pop out. There it lay in his grimy palm, wet with eye goop, scanning my mother's kitchen for a more responsible owner. I can't remember the boy's name, only that his mother dropped him off while she ran a sewing errand with my mom. Either he was the son of Lavon the beautician, who frosted my mother's hair each month, or the boy who lived in the subterranean World War II house that waited like a jilted bride for a main floor that never arrived. In a Saturday morning cartoon, this stray eye would have fallen to the floor into a competitive game of marbles, only to be chased for 20 chaotic minutes by a pair of squeaky chipmunks. But Saturday was long past, and that eye had no chance of rolling anywhere. It was concave, more like half an eye, which made me want it even more. My sister was more interested in the caved-in eyelid. Want to see what it looks like inside? The boy said. I was about to stop him when he pulled back the folds with his free hand. Yuck, my sister said, and I elbowed her. Well, it is yuck, she said. Moist and pink, but clean looking, more mouth than wound. Then he closed it, and I looked from the blue eye on his face to the bluer one in his hand. They make them in a factory, he said, all different colors. What a field trip that would make, better than a warehouse of polished agates. I knew the eye in his hand was only glass, but my, how it glinted, like it possessed special powers. If you rubbed the eye in just the right way and repeated a certain spell, then closed your own eyes, maybe the iris would blink into seeing and relay pictures straight to your brain, my brain. The possibilities were endless. Send it to the drive-in on Sunday nights when movies were taboo. Tape it to a pigeon's leg and let it spy on the neighbors. Drop it into the Blackfoot Reservoir to search out the trophy trout no one could hook. Slide it under the door to the girls' bathroom during recess. Can I hold it? I said. The boy without a name looked me over as if he were weighing the seriousness of our half-hour friendship. Slowly, very slowly, he held out his hand. Just as I was reaching for the eye, his mother drove up. He flipped on the faucet, swiped the eye under the water 2 or 3 times, then leaned his head back like a teenager putting in a contact. And the room turned back to a kitchen. And I slapped off the water, and all 3 of us blinked and kept blinking to get that eye back in place before the vigilant mothers entered the house. Okay, second piece. And what I would say about this memoir that I'm working on is something about audience. Though I grew up Mormon and there's some Mormon stuff in this memoir, that's not the main focus. So I think of my audience as a non-Mormon audience, so I explain things maybe more than I would if I were addressing a wholly Mormon audience, and this is one of the cases. This is called Hang Woman. The most boring church meeting was sacrament, which began at 5 p.m. sharp, and ended only after you melted like the wicked witch of the West into a puddle of salts, or after you turned into a skeleton with cobwebs growing between your ribs. Each talk was more monotonous than the last, and still we had to endure speakers droning on about charity, about not coveting your neighbor's snowmobile, about the widow's mite or the return of the 10 tribes from the north, about keeping your body clean as a temple, about not burning at the second coming. Better pay your tithing, young man, and let's keep your fire insurance up to date. I tried everything to break up the monotony, like excuse myself to go to the lavatory, like put the sacrament bread between my teeth and front lip like a dip of chewing tobacco and make it last in one piece till the final amen. I did that. It lasted one time. It's hard to do. I challenge you to do that. Like look around the congregation for mini dramas. Maybe some 4-year-old was feeding licked Cheerios to her baby brother. Or the tow-headed McGonagall kid was hiking up his mother's skirt to reveal her pretty Mormon underwear. Or maybe my Sunday school teacher was rubbing his wife's immense shoulder with his left hand, mangled by an industrial meat grinder when he was 17, and useless except on Halloween when he could bloody it up with food coloring and scare trick-or-treaters. No matter what I did, boredom seeped back in and threatened to take me under. Lucky for us kids, Dad ignored us, so long as we kept quiet and limited our props to a pencil and a church program. He had better things to do than police us, like trimming his fingernails. Not done with nail clippers either, but with the blade of his Swiss Army knife, sharp enough to slice off an ear. To avoid a mess, he collected the fingernails in a tiny pile, then deposited them in his pants cuff, like a miner saving flecks of gold. My older sister, Chris, and I would insert here, she was 7 years older, so she was my idol, really. Chris and I, meanwhile, partnered up against boredom and played games. We might warm up with tic-tac-toe or dots and boxes, but we quickly moved to Hangman, the best paper game in the known universe. Also the most desperate and magical. It was like ESP. You had to zero in on the one word out of a million that your enemy was thinking. It was like sin. All things hidden shall be revealed. It was like a Ouija board, an entire alphabet at your disposal, and ghosts to tell you what to do next. Chris was kind enough to dumb down her vocabulary, but still she guessed my words quickly, which meant we spent most games with her doing the hanging. She'd calmly sketch the furniture of death, stairs, scaffolding, the exquisite noose, then lay out her secret word in gashes. In response, I would send in vowels to do reconnaissance, then the workhorse consonants, S, T, and R. And with each wrong guess, the victim assembled. Only with Chris, it was always a she, not hangman, hangwoman. That's right, she liked to noose up girls. I don't know why. I don't know if she knew why. But it may have had to do with making things equal. It may have had to do with her dropping out of seminary the year before. Seminary was a class in junior high and high school that kids could take as an elective to learn more about their religion. This was an option for all believers, Catholics, Jews, Methodists, born-agains, Jehovah's Witnesses, but almost none of these churches bothered. By contrast, since roughly half the kids in Pocatello were Mormon, and since church leaders wanted to keep their kids on the straight and narrow, LDS seminary was huge. We even had our own buildings, red brick affairs across the street from each junior high and high school in the city. For a few semesters, seminary went great guns for Chris. Then she ended up with brother holier than a prophet. No, I don't know his real name. But a well-meaning zealot who felt that his marriage was a good blueprint for every marriage, especially those that didn't exist yet, namely those of the children in his class. Seems brother holier than a prophet had a wife who was pretty as a queen, but even more pretty once she put her face on and did her hair and squirmed into a nice dress, which she accomplished 7 days a week by getting up an hour early, which routine she followed with a hot breakfast for brother holier than a prophet and the sleepy holier than a prophet children, a thing she was more than happy to do as a mother in Zion. Well, my sister took exception to this and said girls shouldn't have to get up early just to be beautiful and do extra work. And why didn't brother holier than a prophet make breakfast for his wife sometimes? Brother holier than a prophet said all things in his household were equal, only different. If my sister had the Holy Spirit with her, she'd know what he meant. That's when Chris stormed out of the class. That evening, she took up matters with Mom, who said Mr. Holier than a Prophet's marriage wasn't a blueprint for anything, and if Chris wanted to drop out of seminary, it was okay with her, which my sister did. This in turn caused certain people to worry about Chris's salvation in the short term, and more importantly, her marriage prospects in the long term. In the meantime, lucky scholar, she had more hours than ever to study Latin. So whether you blame Brother Holier than a Prophet or someone else, my sister Chris had a thing for hanging girls. And hanging was organized work. First, the movie star head with flippy hair, followed by the twin isosceles of torso and skirt. Always some over-the-top cutie appeared, like Ginger on Gilligan's Island, who wore slinky, sequined dresses but lived in a hut made out of palm leaves. Was Chris punishing these girls or giving them an equal chance in the world? I wasn't sure, but I knew my job. Sweep in like the wind and save each one. What was Chris's secret word? What letter should I guess next? I didn't have much time. She was already adding spangly bracelets and go-go boots. Was I secretly trying to save my sister? After all, sisters are a special brand of darkness brothers grow to love. If Chris had a problem, it was this. She wasn't fallen enough. She didn't stay out late or carouse or come home with hickeys. She didn't drink herself silly behind our parents' back, didn't cheat on tests, didn't suffer from kleptomania. Stolen goods collecting in her closet like a summer of souvenirs. I sometimes read her diary. Boring. All she did with boys was kiss them. But she was dang good at word games. And with each wrong guess, the movie star in her head would turn more real. Now the starlet had eyes and jangly earrings, and now a reckless smile. And still I try to keep the hanging girl alive. Chris and I must have looked like a pair of dueling gods playing tug-of-war over the half-made woman. And then, to our relief, the battle didn't matter anymore because the congregation was singing a hymn. And someone was saying the last amen, and finally Chris and I had our own bodies back. We could move and breathe them, stretch and hurry them, give them a decent drink of water, and fling them into the dark. We were fighting for the same cause now, freedom. Our Father followed us out into the gasping cold and paused long enough to empty his pant cuff of fingernails. There was something ritualistic about this gesture, borderline holy. In winter, those fractioned moons fell into the snow, white on white. The rest of the year, they disappeared into the grass, like seed into a parable. Was he planting or getting rid of, remembering or forgetting? Lord, it was cold, but at least church was over. We climbed into the family station wagon and tunneled our way home through the forgiving dark. Thank you. So I thought we'd open it up to questions you might have about personal history versus memoir. Anything is really fair game. Before I forget, I have possible reading list. This is not meant to be exhaustive or even representative, but it has 15 texts which have been important to the two of us. It skews more toward recent books, including Tara Westover's Educated and Terry Tempest Williams' Refuge, which I came up with without conferring with Laura. So anyway, I'll just put these here if you're interested. So, should we do this together? What do you think? Questions, comments? What's on your mind? Yeah.
I'll ask one for both of you.
Yeah.
Because you said the focus is not on growing up Mormon. And I assume the focus of Claudia's is not her relationship with Richard. So my question is, what is the larger arc or focus of your memoir, if you know? And should a memoir have one?
Well, of course, that's a work in progress like everything else, what I'm actually doing. I started it out by saying, I, Claudia, an autobiography and essays. And I was doing essays on different subjects, and each one stood alone. It was my life, but it was the things I'd been involved in and doing and something like that. And several people said that was not a good idea. It's a pretty straight chronological operation at the moment. I've also thought of doing it a Mormon life, because it certainly is a Mormon life, but it's a lot of other things too. So I don't know. I'm always open to suggestions, Laurel, and your suggestions are always good, so talk to me afterwards.
I would say that the Mormonism is important, but it's not the sole focus. So I guess I thought about writing this. Two things came into play. I would share things that happened in my childhood with my wife, Jackie, who's from a much more sophisticated state, New York, upstate New York. She only mentions upstate when someone forces her to say she's not from New York City. But when I would tell her funny things about Idaho, she'd say, oh my gosh, sort of in horror, stepping back, who have I married, this hick. But she thought it was kind of interesting. And so you tend to write what you know. So I thought I'd give it a try that way. I was also influenced by a book by Haven Kimmel called Zippy. It's an autobiography about growing up in Indiana in a very small town. I just love what she did with that, and she had a similar sensibility, so I thought I'd give it a try. Yeah.
I would like to just make oh, sorry, were you through? Yeah. Yeah. I'd just like to make a comment about Lance's writing, which I think is very impressive, and the way he builds a mood. You start with this I. I mean, here it is. It's the absolute ordinary life, but immediately moving into Stephen King territory. Horror, scare, magic, and that's very, and lots of, where you make the comment in the beginning about this biblically, that's a way of, that's the story we know from the Bible that, if your eye offend you, pluck it out. So that brings you into all of good and evil. So anyway, I think he's very good at that, and I just want to comment.
Oh, well, thanks. Well, I think that's one thing that you resort to when you don't have a dramatic story of being abducted, or, I don't want to downplay stories like that, but my growing up was pretty ordinary. And so what I can do is throw language at experience and try to tease out the small quotidian things that happen to everyone, but that we tend to forget. So
that's right.
And that's the impulse of a poet as well. So.
But that also shows that every life can be written about.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I have the pleasure of writing about a book about that one. 14 from these materials. You've written lots of these stories. I put a chronological order ahead and into a flowing document. But the whole point, from my point of view, was it's a multifaceted person. Many things, many people, right? He goes to the students, he goes to his family, his public domain also in some ways. And so I wanted to put stories that reflected on that. We kept them all.
Right.
But and they represented stories. It was real chronological, but it kind of told the story at once. Kind of quite honest.
That's great. Yeah, I think the key is selecting the best stories that you can find. You mentioned the word multifaceted. E.M. Forster, an early 20th century British novelist, has a famous essay in which he discusses flat characters versus round. And I think what we're trying to do is provide the fullest, most multifaceted perspective on someone, whether it's ourselves or someone else. And that's what we're after, is that roundness. And sometimes in personal histories, we tend to flatten ourselves and conform to expectations. And I think a good personal history, a good memoir, a good personal essay is going to break some of those boundaries and defy the expectations.
That's always a good idea.
Sure.
How do you decide what to include when you personally, with each of your writings, how do you decide which stories to focus on?
Well, I think it's always hard to know what you're doing, you do, but you begin. And what do you want to write about right now? I tell people that what they should do, write about the first thing they remember, and then try and figure out, why do you remember that? What is significant about it? And write it down in as much detail as you can. It's just a good place to start. But then I also think, and I know other people who write this way, that they just try and write so much every day, so many pages. And they may start anywhere. And then they may sort out and redo things and so on. And so that's what I do. I pretty much write a piece, and then I sort of put it in a place, and then I go back and redo it, and then do it again. And it's a process of it's like sculpting. I think you've got a large chunk of clay, and you fiddle with it here and then there and then, but eventually it takes shape. So but you never know what you're doing when you start. At least I don't.
That's great. The poet Stephen Dunn once said that he doesn't have a poem on his hands until he is frightened or surprised by something that he has written. So that's a good litmus test. And sometimes you can know a story too well, and it can be too pat and not open up and have surprises. So I would say write what surprises or scares you and see where it takes you.
I would say, just a minute, Chris, but one thing, you mentioned this, Joan Didion said she didn't know what she thought until she wrote it down. I think that's true of everybody. Your mind is very full of junk and go off in all directions. That's why you should write. That's why you should write about your daily life, because that's how you can tell what you're thinking. Yeah.
And if you're after writing about your life, whether it's personal history or memoir, I would not necessarily write the whole thing chronologically. Don't feel obligated to touch everything. Write about what's exciting. And again, sometimes it's our worst enemy as Mormons is to write to life events and say, well, I better write about the day I received my mission call. I should write about the day I was married. Maybe what matters is what happened the day before you were married, or 3 days after you received the mission call, or whatever it is. If you want to write about those momentous events, maybe those don't even enter into the personal essay or the memoir. I would say try to interest your reader and try to interest yourself as a reader as you're writing.
Make it interesting. And also, just because you write it doesn't mean you have to keep it. Yeah.
Claudia, your use of humor is very effective. Do you have to work at it, or is it very natural? That's one question. The other question is, how long have you been married to Richard, and would you do it again?
Oh, I certainly think I lucked out better than anybody in the world. He is absolutely a wonderful husband, and I adore him, absolutely. But, we still couldn't get along, even after we were married. And there are times we still can't, but yes, let's see, we've been married, it'll be 63 years this year. So we've been married longer than most of you are alive. But anyway, yes, it was a good experience. But anyway, I thought that'd be more interesting to you than my life, you see. I'm apologizing again.
Humor.
Oh, the humor. This is just my voice that I finally developed. That's the way I talk all the time now. But I didn't always talk that way. But this is the voice I use. So.
In the back?
Yes, my parents just started to write their history, and I think the focus is very much on faith promotion for their children mean, my mother would never write about my father when she wrote about Richard. That sort of courtship story would never emerge because she's not about writing something interesting. She's about writing something that promotes faith or promotes happy marriage. I don't know.
Yeah.
And so I guess the question is, what advice what's the limitation of that? Even for someone who wants to promote faith, is that a legitimate memoir, or is that sort of an abstraction of life or something that's not that memoir?
It sounds to me like that's a different genre entirely, and I would say write that, but also write a memoir. But I think what you risk in just simply writing a monument to your own righteousness or to the gospel, etc., is just an ensign talk that I don't know, that not that ensign talks can't be of great interest. I would say if they are themselves and they tell their stories fully, complete with foibles and contradictions, the children will value that more than putting up a facade. I probably wouldn't say it that bluntly if they were here, but I think that's what I would say. And what happens in my own writing is that when I do that, the writing almost never works and I have to peel away the facades.
Yeah.
We have a question here.
I spent quite a number of summers out in the middle of nowhere doing oral histories for Leonard Arrington and typing them.
Fantastic.
And the thing I've wrestled with ever since is this impulse we have as humans to craft a story. And I love that, and I don't love that. And quite often you'll tell your family stories to other members of your family, and they'll say, that's not what happened. They'll say quite irritatingly. And so, and yet it makes a better story when you craft it as a story. So I wonder how best to wrestle with that. And the book I would recommend is Mary McCarthy's A Catholic Girlhood. It's a classic.
Well, I would say that there is no truth. Everything that you get anywhere has been through somebody's mind or other. And if you're going to write it, it's going through your mind. And you might as well just write it as you understand and know it. I certainly have that experience. My sisters read my stuff and say, well, that isn't what happened at all. Well, it isn't what happened to them, even though they were in the same household. But, that's what happened to me. So you've got to only tell, all that you can do is tell the story as you understand it. And, of course, the longer from the time that you write it, the more neatly it is packaged. So that's why it's a good idea to write now.
All I would add to that is just reinforce exactly what Claudia said, is that when we try to tell a true story, we assume that we are accessing what originally happened. But studies have suggest that we are remembering the last time that we told the story, that there's no recovering that Edenic moment. So that idea of telling the truth, it's balderdash. So.
Well, in that book, Educated, she has at least 8 footnotes where she said, that's how I remember
Right.
my brothers dispute that.
And
then she resisted the impulse to have a happy ending.
a master narrative, yeah.
With a happy ending, it never came.
And that actually, I think, adds authenticity and interest to a piece if you can build in that contradiction and make yourself an unreliable narrator.
Yeah. Then you're trusted more.
Along that line, did Richard Bushman write a revival?
Well, yes, actually. Where was he? I guess he's gone.
No,
I
he's
guess
right here.
Still there. He is writing
He's taking
his
notes
story,
right now.
but he doesn't put in as much nuance as I do.
So,
When you're writing your story and you're trying to be truthful to your experience or authentic, how do you edit yourself? And if so, how do you edit yourself where your life intersects with other people's? So, for example, maybe your experience, sharing your experience might be an unflattering thing to a character in your story. So how do you deal with that? Do you just do it?
don't show it to them.
Don't show it to them.
Don't show it to them? Yeah. Well, actually, that's a situation I've dealt with because I transcribed my mother's journal from the day she was married till the day she had her final stroke. And it's just wonderful, full of all kinds of great stuff. But there are several things in there that I don't want to share with the family. They would be offensive. My suggestion is don't say anything that you will regret. Don't write it down if it's going to hurt somebody or because you want to write to be read. right to be read, and think of what that means. And maybe I don't say everything.
This is for Claudia. Claudia, you said you didn't always speak with this current voice, that you developed this voice. Can you tell us about the process of how you developed your current voice?
You just write a lot, and of course you talk a lot. You talk a lot. You develop a voice. I mean, that's the important thing, isn't it? You have to do your voice. I mean, you've got Lance's great voice where he's describing at the same time he's thinking of all the stuff in the background. You know, that's his voice. He's got half a dozen voices speaking at once. But practice, you know, that's like the old joke. A late girl says to the cab driver, "Can you tell me how to get to Carnegie Hall?" You know that? Practice, babe, practice. That's a very funny joke, really, but it's a New York joke. It's a New York joke.
We have a couple more minutes. Other questions? Yeah.
There's a story, kind of a fable, but no, it's a story about Bill Cox, who was state president in Cambridge, and we got that through Chase Peterson's autobiography one way. We got that through President Nelson's conference talk another way, and I imagine Claudia and Dick might have been there when that happened, when he was active. His daughter argues it was a cigarette, not a cigar. But I think Chase and President Nelson both vote for the cigar. So
Cigars is what I remember. And it was certainly true, and swearing and all this. But it's just a wonderful example to me of the way being active in church work. What he was doing was checking out that building. Every day the building, he would go by and see what had been built, ball out the builders and say, tear it out, do it over again. He did that every day. And finally the building was done to his satisfaction. And in doing so, he converted himself to the church, became the bishop, the stake president, temple president. I mean, he went all the way. And it was really that. But he had been a cigar-smoking, swearing guy with a faithful wife for 100 years before that.
Sounds a lot like the Apostle Paul.
Yeah. Anyway. Okay.
Yeah.
So I had this idea for an activity for a long time, and I thought it would be fun to have a bunch of people gather at tables and put a pile of pennies in the middle. And then you grab a penny and you look at the year so you can see it, and quickly write down everything that you can think of from that year that was interesting to you, and then put it back to the number. I mean, is that just grabbing snippets? Is that a good way to start?
I think it's a great way to start. Absolutely. Let me just elaborate a bit. This was not my idea. I think a student came up with it. But she was talking about how to write memoir. And she asked people that were interested to commit 1 hour a week or even half an hour a week on a Sunday. They would sit down and simply write about whatever trigger they wanted to. Not start at the beginning and, you know, like a mule, pack your way through to the end, but just one day and just write whatever occurs to you. And try to get down sensory information, the way the world smelled, what you thought about, what you saw, not trying to teach anything. And so that idea of the penny, it's a heuristic, it's a device to get you to do that very thing. So sounds great. I mean, it introduces a certain element of chance, which I think would be great fun. You can sort it out later, but the problem is if you start with these high expectations and that you have to perform in a prescribed way, you're going to write badly. What you want to do is find ways to open up the unconscious, and I think this is a way to do it.
Hi. We were talking before maybe some painful events that you might not want to write about. How do you get around that? In my own experience, I've had some painful events growing up. And can I write about that, or is there a way to get around it?
Well, you know, you don't have to name names. You can write anything you want. You really don't want to write libel of any kind. You can also write things from your point of view rather than his. You know, you can just, you don't, and do not accuse people of things in your writing. You know, it's the same way as carrying on a conversation. Don't say mean things to people's faces. You know, you can just talk. And I think you can hide a lot of things that you want to talk about. I mean, all of us ladies that have had physical abuse of some kind, you know, we didn't want to name those people, but you can say that the thing happened. And that's how I would get around that. I don't want to write anything that I wish I hadn't written. That's my rule. So, and of course, Richard puts up with a lot.
Please.
My children want to see the write my story. And they say, best way to do it, a lot of do it, is we have some questions, and then we take, but I don't like that. It just seems like I don't have an opportunity to really think about an experience or a story or something that's real important. So I say no to that. And they don't necessarily want to win that, but I'd like to tell, like you said, go into something and write my first feeling and make something, you know, enjoyable. I don't want, you know, that. If you have a certain question, what year, that, a lot of people do that.
I would say that approach is maybe a good starting point, or it can be if you don't have anything else. If the person especially is unwilling to write, that's a great place to start. Sounds like you don't have that problem, so I would say follow what works best.
I'd say write scenes.
Yeah, that's
that
great.
describe a whole thing. Put in some dialogue, you know.
Yeah.
Lance writes lots of dialogue.
Detail over generality. Show, don't tell.
But I'm a little troubled by this notion of silence about troubling things. I mean, there are things that, gosh, we wish somebody had written down as a historian, and we also have a certain responsibility to a larger community. So I get your point about libel, and I get your point about generosity. I really do, but I'm also, I think a lot of us have these things that happen in our life that maybe should be known.
Okay, where is the best place to
And
deal
how
with
do you do
those?
that?
Well, I don't do it very well because I'm of the old school, you know. You don't want to offend people. So, you know, there it is.
Your family, it's interesting, your mother's diary, it will survive.
Yes,
And they could read the diary.
That's
and
right.
find that.
but I
So
just
you're
haven't.
you're not blocking it out and taking away the power of someone
Yeah.
else.
Well, you know how easy it is to censor things. Well, here.
Yeah.
Well, you may remember I was working on my grandmother's autobiography for a long time. And when she was moving down from this place, she says they shot the cat and gave the dog away. Well, my kindly cousin, hijacked my project, took the thing I had transcribed from this diary and published it himself. And as he said to me, says, I only changed a few things. I said, Larry, don't touch that thing. And he said, well, I couldn't have her known as a person who shot her cat. So the things that upset some people don't upset other people. But, you know, I am generally in favor of absolute the truth and tell everything, but I haven't done it. Have you? And what are the things we should tell that we haven't? And is it too late?
And we'll have to leave that as the mystery. Thank you so much.
Right, our time's up. Thank you.